Emerging technologies both challenge and reward the financial services industry. With the advent of the Internet of Things, we've seen the development of new technologies, innovative applications, creative ways to solve problems, and the emergence of new opportunities that demand our attention. We've developed context-rich systems to respond to the new environment, adapting our use of analytics and intelligence. Innovations such as virtual currency may become some of the biggest disruptors in the history of IT. It's time to ask some big questions. How will this adaptive, smart approach affect the decision-making process? Our customers demand an always-on relationship. How do we meet their needs and provide continuous availability? How will we identify our customers? How will our customers identify us? Can we create an indisputable digital identity? How do we get ahead of ever more sophisticated cyber threats? Can we become more efficient by joining forces? How long can we hide inside the castle walls? It's time to find some big answers.
Good morning. Welcome to the session focusing on digital ID at Cyberboss. I'd like to first introduce our esteemed panel. We've gathered from around the world. I think they all bring in experience and expertise and perception that are going to make this panel a very interesting and engaging discussion. We also have some questions which we're going to ask you for some answers on. So if you're currently sitting on something that looks like an old BlackBerry, don't throw it away like your old BlackBerry. But you'll be using that. And at the end, we will have some time for some Q&A. So if you save up some questions for the end, we'll certainly allow time for the panel to respond. If I'd first like to introduce the panel, Osama Fayed is Group Chief Data Officer for Barclays. Osama comes with a long experience in the data industry from an analytics and from an operational point of view. He's currently responsible for the performance, governance and management of operational and analytical data at Barclays, and also from creating new value from data. So digital ID is very core to his business. His previous career involves being head of Chief of Digital Data Services for Yahoo, and he's also been heavily involved in tech industry, leading a fund, and also has a long history of speaking engagements and holds a number of patents. So welcome, Osama.
Thank you.
Secondly, on my left, introduce Sean Gilchrist, Managing Director of Commercial Digital at Lloyds Bank. Sean has been at Lloyds since the start of 2014 and that time built a commercial digital function as part of the group digital vision and launched a new commercial banking online channel. Sean's career spans more than 25 years, previously with Barclays, where he held the position of Managing Director of Digital Banking, and he played an instrumental role in the transformation of digital banking at Barclays, being involved in their Pingit and mobile banking for Barclays. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you.
And finally, on my left, we have NGS. NGS is Executive Vice President for Tata Consulting Services and head of Tata Consulting Services Financial Solutions, a strategic business unit of TCS. He has over 30 years' experience in the industry and has performed a multitude of roles delivering to TCS customers globally. And part of his current role, he is responsible for steering the financial products business under the name of TCS Banks. He's been around the industry a long time and is an active speaker on the global circuit. And his experience in technology and the business side of solving solutions for customers will be a great addition to the panel. So welcome, panel. If I'd just like to start off, I think maybe I should just say a few words who the GSMA is, because I'm not from your industry, although I think you'll find that our industries are coming closer and closer together. So GSMA is the Global Association for Mobile Operators. We represent over 800 mobile operators around the world and also bring together ecosystem partners, including more than 250 global corporates, of which a growing number of them are people involved in the financial services industry and even a few banks. And we're also challenged by digital ID, obviously. It seems only a few years ago in our daily lives, identification was a physical paradigm. Digital ID is, in our lifetimes, a relatively new concept and growing more and more. By the time you've got here this morning, you've probably used a number of digital IDs, whether it's your email, your messenger, checking up on Facebook, perhaps you took an Uber ride to get here, and maybe you checked your online banking or something like that. So you've used a number of digital IDs just to get into this room. On a personal level, that introduces challenges and difficulties for us, trying to manage the number of digital IDs. I suppose probably most of us in the room on a daily basis are concerned about our children's digital IDs and their presence online, which adds extra challenge to ourselves. And the growth of digital IDs and online re-engineering of business models is escalating the number and the scale and the impact on our lives on a daily basis. Amongst mobile operators, we have around 3.7 billion unique users around the world. Many of them, most of them, accessing the internet on a daily basis with multiple digital IDs. But the ownership and security is being challenged universally. Your industry, my industry, and all the other services online. And the risks are multidimensional. I'll just do a quick temperature check around the room. Who trusts their social media with their digital ID and information? Quick hands up. How about your telco? Do you trust your telco? Do you trust your bank? Well, at least there's a few hands. I was starting to get very alarmed there. I mean, okay, I can understand social media and telcos, but banks, you're from the industry. So I think we all have a perception on what are the challenges. And so I think maybe if I go to the panel who are going to help guide us through some of these issues we're going to discuss, it should be a great topic. So first maybe refer to Osama. Given that ID comes from a physical world, is there a past, is there a history, like a social, cultural, or technology paradigms that limit digital ID going forward, or maybe provide opportunities for digital ID going forward?
So let's see where to start. Well, first, I'll make a comment about Julian's questions to you guys. There have been multiple surveys, global surveys, and the results are consistent that people actually trust their banks for the digital ID more than the government. And usually at the bottom is the social media IDs, so Google, Facebook, which are the most universal in usage today. So one hypothesis is this is really for the banks to lose, right? They already have it. Question is what gets rolled out. Now, I don't know if your question is more around history or future, but the biggest driver. So number one, is there a need, and what is the equivalent of the physical ID in the world, in the digital world? Identification it's fundamentally a social phenomenon, right? You need other identities to identify you, and that's how you build an identity. It's very, very much needed in the digital world. And now we're hitting sort of two major drivers of it, beyond sort of banking and payments. The major drivers are Internet of Things. So think of a world where you have many, many devices that are somehow affiliated with you. So those devices need to know to whom do they belong. They also need to be able to do things on your behalf. And many of them today will require actually payment authorization, right? They can order supplies, they can order service, etc. on your behalf. So ID in that world, digital ID, becomes an absolute necessity. It's not an option. You must have it, otherwise you can't function in that world of Internet of Things. The second part is, of course, Gen X and Gen Y. These are generations that are basically mobile first, completely digital, and we have to have an answer for that. We have to have an answer that actually allows us to do all this. Historically, it hasn't been a very good story. There's been many, many attempts, be they by technology companies, also by banks, payment companies. Probably the most well-known is one that started out of the frustrations of using PayPal. In 2009, PayPal with a bunch of other companies created a framework, which is probably the most comprehensive one today, called FIDO, for Fast ID Online. And there's an alliance that includes some banks, some financial services institutions. And in 2013, it was joined by Google's framework for second factor authentication, U2F. So we now at least have a framework that says, here's how you plug in things like physical, biometric, etc., with second factor. Yet, to this date, we don't have a true ID online that we can trust, which is very, very sad.
Okay. Maybe if I refer to NGS, what do you find with your customers and your consulting? I mean, are they coming to you with problems they bring from the past, and do they understand what digital ID is?
I think, as more and more services are getting online, clearly there is a need to verify, validate, authenticate the identity of the person. There's no doubt about it. I think banks have probably solved it, and each one of them have taken an approach to do it in their own way. But if you take governments, citizen services, and as you go in expanding some of this, the real personal identity behind it, especially as you go through a self-service process, is clearly an issue today. And banks are equally worried because finally it all lands up into some payment gateway. Right? More than identifying an individual per se, I think people are also looking at a solution for, let's say, fraud prevention and cybercrime. Right? I think these are all quite related. So as I speak to our clients across the domains, if you take financial services on one side, because they all seem to have solved it in their own way and it's not a bigger problem. But if you go to other verticals, whether it is retail or whether it is government or manufacturing, as more and more devices are getting connected, right, it is an issue. And how do you prevent fraud? How do you address the issue of cybercrime? Is digital identity is the real solution? That question just certainly comes up.
So Sean, from your perspective then, I mean, leading or being involved in certainly some of Barclays' first digital services, how do you see digital ID as, or where it's coming from as guiding where we should be going in the future?
Yeah, probably I think if we go back to your question there around the physical world and the history of it, I tend to always come at things thinking about it from the user's point of view and from our customer's point of view. And I think what's interesting is in the physical world, we're comfortable with a number of IDs. We kind of live with that. The ID that we have when we walk into the shop and get recognized is a different one when we go into the bank and get recognized. So I think we operate naturally with a number of different personas and IDs in the physical world. Our work persona is different from our social persona. And I think what's interesting is now translating that into the digital space. And the difference with the digital space is actually things are much more accessible by everybody. You can't compartmentalize your life and your personas as easily in the digital world as in the physical world. And I think we're seeing those early trends starting to come out from the early digital adopters who are now coming out of university and further education and starting to get their first jobs. And of course, the first thing I do when a CV lands on my desk is I do a social media search on that individual. And the reaction you get is, hang on a minute, that's not the purpose of that data that I put out there. So why are you using that to look at who I am? My university life's irrelevant to you hiring me. And so I think there's a starting to be a growing or an emerging trend around people wanting to be more protective around their data and be more aware and more protective about who they share what with. So that then starts to say, well, actually, digital identity becomes more and more important because people are starting to think about the implications of what they share with whom. And I think that's where the challenge really starts from.
Okay. Well, maybe with that, we'll refer to the audience. We've got a question we'll put up on the screen for you. Maybe to give some feedback and some context where you're at, is what is your organization's maturity level around usage of digital ID? So you can see the options there, if just you grab your little BlackBerry-looking device, you press your numbers 1 to 5, and press the green button to make sure it's submitted. And during that, perhaps we've got 10-second countdown, which will start shortly. There we go. So what is digital identity? Used in many critical applications, used in critical application, only critical? Or, so there we have our results. Okay. Perhaps, Sean, do you want to make a comment about the results? Is that a surprise to you, or not a surprise to you as to most popular as a usage is mainstream and aligned across all the organisations, single sign-on? I mean, personally, from a telcos are struggling with single sign-on. We have multiple services, and actually the GSMA is currently working with the industry to try and build single sign-on. Because it's not uncommon for users to use a different ID to log into their customer care as they do online for their services, as they do to use many of their online services. So, Sean, any comments from?
Yeah, I am a bit surprised by those. Assuming that we've got a bunch of bankers in the room, I'd have expected much more in 4 and 5 than we see in 2 and 3 there. What's interesting though is I think it probably illustrates, and it's my guessing, is people don't think about this a lot. And actually when you do stop to think about it, the level of security and protection that we naturally work with in a bank actually is much higher and much more robust. But because you just use it every day, it takes a little bit of stop and bringing it into your conscious and start to think about, actually, I can only access the things that I should be able to access, and the other stuff I can't, and actually the deeply protected stuff is very hard to get to. So yeah, I'm quite surprised by those results.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add a comment here. I'm not as surprised because I think the audience answered to within the silo of their organization, right? So think of that digital ID that you gave the answer on and ask yourself the question, what happens when you take that same ID out in the marketplace or out to another organization or out and you completely figure out that it doesn't work outside your bank. And if you have multiple banks, it's multiple IDs, right? As a retail customer. And they're completely separate from each other.
Well, maybe that's a nice segue into the next topic then, about what do you think are driving the changes and the evolution and the importance of digital ID? I mean, where are we going? What are the key drivers? Perhaps Samo, if you want to carry on with.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the key driver is it is an increasingly digital world. We gain a lot and we lose a lot, right? So one of the reasons ID hasn't been that much of an issue in the physical world is because, like it or not, because of the slowness of the process and because it required interacting with some human or some physical document, verifying ID wasn't a big deal. In the new world where there are no interactions with other people, it becomes totally digital, and therefore it's so obvious that you actually need a reliable digital ID to say this entity is exactly who this entity claims to be. And that's the primary driver. We cannot function well in a digital world if we don't have a reliable ID. Now, you always have to keep in mind that, as was mentioned earlier, people are comfortable having multiple IDs, and sometimes multiple IDs is the right thing to have, whether it's social, professional, etc. But you have to have those, and they have to be reliable enough. And in the physical world, we just relied on things like appearance and physical location and community around you. What is the equivalent in the digital world, right? How do you capture that, and how do you make it reliable and useful? That's the big challenge, and I think we'll get there. I think we've seen it in certain areas, and we've seen poor attempts in the past or pseudo-successful attempts. In the world of e-commerce, you may not worry too much about the consumer's digital ID. I mean, that's a problem between the company, the e-commerce company, and the consumer. But from the consumer perspective, you have to worry about the identity of that entity that you're doing commerce with. So IdenTrust is an example that sort of led to the what's called the SSL, which is the secure HTTP protocol that's used in web browsers, where companies, entities are actually certified from authorizing agencies or authorized entities that sort of can issue you a certificate. And that certificate allows you to have effectively an encrypted conversation or transaction over the web. And now everybody is switching over to it, including your Google, Yahoo, Facebook. Everybody uses HTTPS. Nobody now uses just open HTTP. That requires identity verification. That requires you to know that this site I'm talking to is actually a real site. It's really Amazon. It's really, whatever entity you're trying to reach, your bank. To do that, your bank has to purchase a certificate, or Amazon purchases a certificate that says, I am who I am. And unfortunately, there are many problems the way it got implemented today, that there are secondary and tertiary authorities to issue that identity, and we're quickly losing trust in it, just as it's picking up in usage, where everybody's adopting it. So these are things that you really need to think about, right? Otherwise, it's so easy for a third party, man-in-the-middle attack or what have you, to pretend they are your bank, they are Amazon, they are whoever, and collect all sorts of information about you.
So picking up on Osama's point about certain technology, maybe driving standards, NGS, do you think that there's OEMs or certain verticals or maybe government that actually can lead or are driving this individually in their own direction, or can drive it in this direction?
Yeah. And I think before I come to that, I think while we are all comfortable managing multiple IDs, I have a slightly different perspective to it. One is, today nobody bothers whether I am in Singapore or in New York or in London. What they are bothered about is whether I am online or offline. Right? So if I am online, then if people think that I am online, it's very important for me to ensure that the right identity is being seen as being online. Right? So in that context, I'm not sure whether we want to have multiple identities in the digital world for one real identity. While we evolved like that, the complexity of bringing one single digital identity is going to take time. I feel that we should pursue towards a one single digital identity. Right? I think that's probably going to take time, and then we have to manage the transition process. The second is, I was also talking to a few of my friends in some of the governments, and they feel that having someone personifies as somebody else, is a big issue. And towards controlling and curbing cybercrime, they would really like to see one digital identity, one trusted digital identity, as a way forward. Right? I think that's something that's, and some of the governments have taken some initiatives. Right? For example, in India, the Aadhaar initiative, the Unique Identification Initiative, has taken a big leap. And as a part of, I think they have collected certain biometric information, certain personal information, and so on, so on. And likewise, Estonia has offered, a small country, all right, but they have gone a long way in terms of creating a digital identity and offering more than 400 government-related services, encrypted emails, access to all the citizens, and so on, so on, right? So the real challenge is, I think, what constitutes a digital identity, right? Should we have, and who should own it? It's a big question. Some governments feel that, we should have a federated structure. Some people feel that, we should have a syndicated structure. But be that as it may, I think what constitutes it, there is a generic information that on which, people can rely on. And others like banks or, other service providers may have their own view, there are more extensions to it as they need it. But the real issue is standards are evolving still. How do you connect to that, and how do you verify, a particular person's identity, be it in terms of DNA or be it in terms of voice tags or be it in terms of biometric information. These are, I think, evolving. And in a digital world, everything is going to be self-service. I do believe that having a consistent standard, consistent digital identity representation is going to go a long way for fraud prevention.
So back to the point. So do you think that certain industry verticals, banking or maybe certain OEMs, Apple, will drive or lead these things, or how will we get there? Will there be a convergence to a standard or convergence to a OEM's specific service in the future?
Well, I think a standard is definitely what's needed to make identity work. There'll probably be multiple standards, but the question is, how many multiples can we deal with? So, I can imagine, 2 or 3 of them. That's also natural in the physical world, right? So, in the United States, the authority that issues your passport almost has nothing to do with the authority that issues your driver's license, which is typically the state, which almost has nothing to do with the authority that issues your social security number, which is primarily the key in the US for sort of identifying that you own certain assets, etc., and with the tax. So I think we'll have similar standards evolve online, where there may be something from Apple. Facebook today. I don't know if the audience knows this, but Facebook, Yahoo, Google, many of these, they use something called open authentication, OAuth, which basically allows you to use that's what you use to use your Facebook account to log into multiple sites. And Facebook would love for you to use their ID. Google would love for you to use their ID, and Google now is actually ubiquitous, right? It's on every Android device. Gmail picked up, and they have over 450, 500 million users. That ID actually allows them to track you everywhere, right? To track you physically everywhere. And that's not necessarily a good thing, right? That's an area where an identity probably has many more downsides than upsides, right? The fact that Google can triangulate who you are, and by default you're logged in, and you actually think you're only using it for email, but it's actually on your phone, and it's always turned on. Whenever you use their Maps application, it's actually sending data back as to where you are, how fast you're moving, where you're going, where did you stop. So this is, it is a serious issue. I think it's happening without conscious thought. And it's happening in areas that are, in my opinion, a bit more dangerous than the useful areas. That's why I'm a huge proponent of saying trusted entities that actually have a vested interest in your privacy. And that's why people actually tend to still trust banks here, are probably a better place. It's probably better than government and better than sort of open social networks, etc., where anybody can take on any ID and you can't rely on what you have. So I think we'll have multiple standards, probably not too many, and it's really, really important that we quickly decide which ones we really want to take as trusted.
So Sean, banking's part to play in this? Is it an opportunity, risk for banks?
Yes, I think we absolutely have. I think the technology exists. I think we're missing a dimension in the conversation at the moment, which is the user and actually what's important for them. And I think Osama hit on a key point there, which is about usefulness. So identity, where it's useful in context and relevancy, is what's key. So people will go, okay, I'm happy to log on in a particular way with my bank because I want that to feel safe and secure. You're looking after my money at the end of the day. But actually, I'm more relaxed around the way that I log on to Facebook or Google or my social media. And I think we've got to think more around actually a single digital identity will be driven by, is it useful to me? And it may in some circumstances, but I don't think it will be in all. So I agree that we'll probably end up with multiple identities. I think the interesting bit around it is then the trust bit, and I think this is where the banks have got a big role to play, because actually, would another person or entity trust the bank's identity to say that that person is who they are? And I think we've got an opportunity there to actually exploit it. And again, as Sama's opening comments I thought was very key, which is I think that it's up to us to lose that opportunity. If we don't really start to put more of a stake in the ground and taking more of a leadership role as an industry around, actually this position we've got of being a trusted provider of secure services.
So do you think we need to have stronger IDs? I mean, what's going to drive a stronger ID or a need for a stronger ID? I mean, it's big data, privacy. What's pushing, or what's going to help push banking ID to the fore, and more important, over the social media all-pervasive Facebook login?
So, I mean, this is my opinion. Historically, banks have sort of seen their space as, will help you manage and secure your financial assets and financial instruments. In the new digital world, your digital equivalents of what you thought of in the past as physical entities, your house deed, your copy of your passport, the digital copy of it, all these things that you care about, that you'd like to use, that you'd like to keep in a safe place. It's not too far a stretch to say a bank goes from guarding your financial assets to guarding your financial assets plus digital documents that you care about and that are useful for you in the digital world. So I think people will, in an increasingly digital world, people will look for that solution. And that solution today, you could actually get it by doing, scanning documents yourself and storing them on your Google Drive or your Microsoft Cloud or what have you. The convenience comes from authentication, right? So let's say I have a copy of my driver's license and a copy of my passport online, and I want to use them. Well, wouldn't it be convenient to basically, go to any office or business, and if they require that authentication, I'll say, press this button, and you can get a certified copy of my passport, right? I don't have to hassle with it. The entity receiving it will know that it's genuine because an entity like a bank is essentially vouching for it and storing it. So there is, there is a real need. The distinction between physical goods and financial assets. It's all digital now, and that's why banks are in sort of a very, very good position for that.
So NGS, as the opportunity that Sama lays out, what do you think of the impacts then, or what are the consequences for banks if we would go down that path? I mean, the fraud, the authentication, do we have to step it up?
I think it's a great opportunity, no doubt about it. I think if banks can come together, the potential to create a unique offering and make it convenient for the end users on a trusted basis is something which is, I think people are aware of this and people are exploring such options, right? At the same time, I think that people are not concerned so much about the digital identity. If you say that, look, for example, as I pass through the airport security, there is something that I've enrolled it with my iris scan, and people are able to just, zip through it, and they like it, right? And quite a few people have asked me, what is preventing you guys to actually use similar technology to solve this multiple login IDs, multiple KYCs that I have to deal with, right? So I think, there is if you take in Indian context, the government has gone ahead and in full swing with this. They have linked that identity to bank accounts. by which all the government subsidies are all getting directly transferred to those bank accounts, right? And National Payment Corporation of India, which is again a syndicated body, if I can say that, they are looking at this problem in a much more unique way. And in Australia, the Digital Transformation Office and the Digital India initiatives, they are trying to converge some of this, right? To see who owns what are the principles, right? And what technologies can be productively used, right? And in certain cases, you may, for your health records accessing, maybe you use your DNA sequence, right? For something else, you may use your fingerprints, right? But for something else, you may use your iris scan. But it depends really on, putting horses for courses in some of these use cases and initiatives. But I think the future is really about building such a centralized piece of information. And clearly, standards are evolving. If you really look at it, there is an Open Identity Exchange, which is trying to define some of these standards. And there's an authorization protocol as to, what is the protocol that you should use really to validate and verify in a secured way. And addressing some of the concerns of the privacy issues that as an individual I may have, right? So there are initiatives. And I think, in my opinion, whether banks should do it or government should do it, or we should promote multiple things, and having one single nodal agency that will probably validate it, provide a gateway to do this validation is probably the direction.
I mean, as some of it laid out, search and social media seem to have a relatively dominant or certainly all-pervasive position at the moment. Telcos have mobile numbers for everyone in the world, or users. Banks have their own unique identifiers. What is stopping or what is holding back other industries taking that position? Or is the social media position sustainable? Or is there something that's going to put a bump in their future road that maybe upset their current position?
Yeah, I mean, the social media definitely, right now, the way it is, it's not sustainable for two reasons. One is they are incented by the wrong incentives from the perspective of the customer, right? Most of them are funded through advertising. So they're all around, interruption and, quote unquote, whether we like it or not, spying, right? Finding out where you are despite the fact whether you want them to or not, and then utilizing that to target ads at you. Also online, even though it's pervasive, most human beings today have Facebook IDs. You still don't really know, right? The old internet adage, right? On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Actually, last time Facebook tried to do a cleanup, which was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, they were trying to verify that an account actually belonged to a human being. About 80 million accounts belong to pets and animals and things like that, right? So there's a real problem with how that got set up. Now, if you think about it from the other perspective, why are banks in a good position? Well, look, anytime you onboard anybody, anytime you open an account with a bank, you're actually required to have a reasonable 1 or 2 forms of ID. By reasonable, meaning acknowledged by some government, acknowledged by some community to be a reliable identifier. And I think banks are already in that business. They already have to do that authentication when they first onboard you and identify you. Now turning that into a useful service where you say, look, in situations where you actually want your reliable ID used, and I will re-emphasize here, in an increasingly digital world, a lot of us don't think about this. But when we say Internet of Things, we're talking about all sorts of devices that belong to you, right? They are in your house, in your car, in your mobile, etc. How will these devices know that they belong to you and not somebody else? And how easy will it be for somebody else to take over your identity and potentially your life in the future if you don't have that digital means of authenticating who you are to all these devices? Literally hundreds of them, right? That actually would belong to you. So this is a pressing need, and it's becoming an absolute must And unfortunately, we're not thinking about it enough, and the most predominant IDs happen to be these social media IDs, which are sort of the loosest, least reliable ones, but most pervasive.
Perhaps then, if we put our second question up for the audience, and while that question goes up, I'll ask Sean to comment, based on what we've talked about here, what do you think perhaps are the risks, I mean, whether it's from a customer point of view, or are they internal risks, are the greatest risks for the organizations we face? So for the audience, if you'd like to vote with your 1 to 5 and press the green button, or 1 to 4 and press the green button. Well, Sean, if you'd maybe have a comment on your thoughts around what is the risk, customer risk or internal risk?
So I think they're both, to be honest. And I think it comes back to the point around, the key weakness around a digital identity is the enrollment, because that's the only point you absolutely know that that identity is aligned to who they say they are. And again, if you come back to the context and the relevancy of it, in a social media situation, I don't really care if that person is who they are or not. I'm having a conversation with them and I'm engaged in it. It's fine. Actually, I'd be very worried if I felt that my bank wasn't taking the right level of due diligence around checking that I am who I am before they made a payment on my account. And so again, I think it's thinking about those different levels of robustness within the way that the enrollment around the identity is done to allow the transactions that then come behind that. And I think absolutely right that as that comes more and more into people's consciousness, that there's actually going to be, I think, more of a growing push around a standardized identity, because whether I go and use that identity with a government agency, or whether I use it with my bank, or whether I use it when I'm setting up a new utility, actually, I want something which everybody trusts that is me who it is, and it has a level of certainty behind it that others couldn't take my identity away from me. So I think there is going to be a growing trend around it. I think the difficulty is how do we coalesce as different societies into making that trend a reality in the right way with the right usability for people.
So with the growing number of digital IDs and the growing number of attributes or data associated with those digital IDs, what's your perception, maybe I refer to NGS, perception of the opportunity for big business of starting to sell or complement other digital IDs or the identity in those digital IDs by the merger or the sale of this information that is being collected?
I think, the more IDs you have, the more problems we have. That's for sure, right? If I look back and then say that what are the needs of a consumer on one side, what are the needs of a bank or a retailer or somebody else on the other side, what are the needs of a government on the other side. If I try to link all these needs, I think it's very clear that, look, people, I think the fraud is the top of their agenda, number one. And number two is, then, if we have to, there's a consensus of saying that, look, a unique identity will help, then the issue is one of, who is going to do it, how are we going to, get together to do it. And on the other hand, Dr. Osama mentioned about social IDs as the most used one. So I believe that I can't wait for Apple or Google to become a bank, right? I think when they become a bank, I think the banks and them will collaborate much more quickly, and actually probably the single identity will emerge much faster than you and I think. And on the other, in one of the cities that I visited recently, there was absolutely no policemen in the streets, right? So I was very curious, and I asked about them, how do you really manage this whole thing, right? Apparently, the minute I land and I switch on my mobile phone, I'm tracked, right? And okay, I'm there, I'm meeting with Sean, then okay, Sean and I are together, so there is something going on here. So depending upon the people who are all connected and meeting where they are there, there's a central team which actually figures out whether everything is normal or everything untoward thing is going to happen, right? And they use big data technologies to actually track some of this, right? So the needs from a government, the needs from a bank on such data generated, right, out of the identity and the behavior of that identity is huge and enormous potential, right? I think big data technologies is probably going to play an important role on top of whatever digital identity is going to come.
So do you think, as someone mentioned very early on that I think it's an opportunity for banks to lose digital IDs. NGS, you just mentioned Google and others becoming banks will accelerate this process together. In that merger fight, is there a risk to the banks losing control? Or is that greater than the opportunity or the potential for them to gain the opportunity?
Yeah, I think it's obvious to everyone. It is a huge. Well, I don't know about control, but I think they will lose the opportunity, right? It's rare to be in a position where you already have the trust and you're already addressing, look at the survey results, right? The highest concern there, which is security risks, right? If somebody hijacks your digital identity, it's disastrous today, including, Sean mentioned, he may not care if a social ID got hijacked, but if you look at schools, if you look at sort of the new generation, what's happening, big forms of bullying are actually taking the form of, hacking into somebody's account and then, posting all sorts of, embarrassing things and bad things and all that about themselves online. So it is a big deal. And as you mentioned early on, when you go apply for a job, somebody's going to look at your social media history, where guess what? If it got hijacked at one point and all sorts of stuff, bad stuff got posted, it's not you, but somebody did it on your behalf, it can destroy your life. So it is the bank's opportunity to lose. I think banks are in an increasingly declining margin business, be it from regulatory pressures or competition. And we need to find these models where we actually have an advantage and where we can actually serve the customer better in a natural way, in an area that they care about a lot. And this is a big one. It's one of the biggest opportunities for banks going forward. We are in a good position, yet our inability to move fast enough. And these things typically, the winner, because of the network effects and all of that, are sort of the early movers. The early movers haven't done it well so far, so the opportunity is still open, but it's only open for a limited time when somebody actually jumps in and starts doing it correctly. And that takes the opportunity away from banks, which would be a shame, because not because necessarily banks should win. It's because they're already in that business. They're already doing that verification. It's part of what they need to do anyway. And the relationship with the retail consumers and with businesses is one around something that matters a lot: financial assets. So I think it's a natural one, and it would be a shame to sort of wait until Apple becomes a bank, which they already have a license, and Google already got a license, so everybody's turning into a bank.
So do we think it's a ubiquitous opportunity? We're sitting here in Singapore surrounded by more than half the world's population, of which many of them don't have bank accounts. Last year I worked in Myanmar, where very few people had bank accounts and they don't trust banks because of what happened a few years ago with banks collapsing. Do you think certain things will need to be done differently here in Asia versus maybe in Europe or American environments? Maybe for NGS, your experience in India? Or?
Well, I think the sheer number of volume in terms of people connected in Facebook or WhatsApp from Asia is huge, right? I think digital adoption is phenomenal. And then the proliferation of smartphones in Asia is probably at a rate which is much higher than the Western world today. So it gives a tremendous opportunity to do a lot of things in mobile. And traditionally, if you think, if you take Asian countries, they have leapfrogged. When they probably, skip one of the technology evolutions, in a way, right? If you talk about a typewriter to word processor, and in between we skip the electronic typewriter, so to speak, right? Straight away, it moved into a word processor kind of era, right? So Asia is always used to, learn from the mistakes or other initiatives that have happened from the other past, and then skip the technology wave and go and adopt a more current and latest one, right? So from that perspective, I think, it is a terrific opportunity to try out different things. I think India has taken the lead in terms of putting that unique identification authority for 1 billion plus people, which is by itself is a commendable effort. And the do's and don'ts, what are the issues, right? How do you centrally manage such a big database, right? What are the technology issues that you need to overcome, right? And how do you roll out analytics around it for government security purposes or otherwise, right? And likewise, when the Australian office, Digital Transformation Office, as I mentioned, they have created a number of guidelines and principles. So I think, in Asia, given that there is a lot more digital adoption, at the pace at which the digital adoption is taking place in Asia is far faster than in Europe and other places. But I believe that, there's an opportunity to define something and learn from this, certainly.
So, Sean, you've pioneered a number of services. Do you now start to look at Asia as maybe leading in some of these areas around digital ID, or is it still more a concern of what's happening in Europe, or how important is Asia?
I think when you look around the world, actually there are different dynamics at play which drive different behaviors. So it's interesting when you look at the way mobile banking's evolved. Actually, as NGS said, they're in the third world or emerging countries, it's really leapfrogged. And the reason for that is because actually it's quite a low density population where the mobile infrastructure is more advanced than the fixed line. So actually it was easier to create reach through the mobile phone than it was. You look in a developed country, say like the UK, actually everybody, the penetration of the internet per household is the highest in Europe. And so actually, you kind of go, well, mobile banking has got to play a different role in this. And it came down to actually, why did it take off? Well, it's because it became snack banking. So I could check my balance very, very quickly on the move, which was the most important thing I wanted to do. I could quickly make a payment on the train. And so it became more of a convenience thing than actually this was the way I do my banking because, it's a 2-day bus ride to the local branch and actually I can do everything here. Or, I work remotely from my family and actually it's a very safe way of sending them money that they can then use. So I think there are different dynamics at play and I think you need to be very thoughtful around those, rather than kind of putting a one-size-fits-all around actually the way people will adopt the technology and the role that the bank then plays in it.
Osama, any comment on?
No, I mean that's well said. Yes.
Okay. Well, perhaps then we take the opportunity for the questions from the audience. We have some microphones that will come around. If you could just say your name, where you're from, and your question.
My name is Gerard Hatzing. I'm chairman of the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation that was created by the G20 FSB, and the objective is to roll out globally the legal entity identifier system for legal entities. I have 2 points for the panel. One, the whole data protection dialogue, and you were very focused on citizens, but not on legal entities. Has data protection any, from your perspective, influence on the legal entity debate around the globe, such as the LEI or other systems? Second, would it not be better in the end for the business community, but also for the government community, that legal entities, which are public or private, create more transparency who they are on the internet? And would it not help the citizens that if they communicate with legal entities, public or private, that they know who's really behind it. 2 points for the panel.
Okay, I'd like to hit one on.
I'll start with the second question. Yeah, I mean, knowing who you're communicating to online, be it from mobile or web, is a huge problem, right? And to this date, it's still a problem, right? It's very easy fairly easy actually, for any site to masquerade as your target site and get you to disclose all sorts of information. So in the business world, in the increasingly digital business world, that identification of a company and reliably assuring a consumer that they're talking to the right entity is huge. Otherwise, if you don't have trust, you can't have business. I forgot what the first part of the question was.
Data protection. Yeah.
Data protection, yeah. I mean, that's huge. Again, if you protect it, then how do you enable the right person and or authorized entity to access it? And again, that one requires the secure or the reliable digital identity. So both of those are huge drivers.
I think in the context of the conversation, I would take a legal entity in as a person and vice versa. I think your point's an absolute right one, and Osama's answer there, which is actually, it's just as important in the corporate and commercial world as it is in the personal world to have the similar sort of standards and again, the similar sort of digital identities.
Time for one more?
Time for one more? Yes.
Okay. Ken Price, Warp Global, formerly the founder of AVOX, which is plugged into the LEI system. The biggest challenge I see is the international disparity in data protection, regulation, legislation around the world. So my question to you is, would it not make sense for SWIFT to help the financial community collaborate more effectively to address this digital ID, and how would you do so?
And Jess, do you want to make a comment, given India's move, the government moves to create the identity?
I think SWIFT is probably well positioned, right? That all the banks use them, number one. Number two is they have a large foray into corporates today, so which essentially addresses the legal entity point that the other gentleman raised. There's also been a talk about an utility for KYC, being promoted and managed by SWIFT. So if you really look at, finally now, when you want to open an account, we want a trusted certification from somebody, right, a government agency or someone else. I think that such a KYC utility could actually form a good basis. If finally it's all about that, and can it be expanded in scope to offer a digital identity in the future, is perhaps possible. But the trouble is that, look, so far, SWIFT has not gone into the retail side of it, the consumer side of it, right? So it's primarily, attacking the corporates and the institutions, right? But here we have to deal with, not just the legal entities, right, but people and persons, right? But that's going to be probably one of the issues that we'll have to talk about. But I'm not, otherwise the KYC efforts of SWIFT can actually form a good basis.
Sean?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think the question actually is one for SWIFT. Do they want to play a role in this? And what is the role that they can play in it? And do they want to act as a catalyst and a leader in it? So it's the same question for SWIFT as I think we in the banks face in terms of how do we answer the question.
I think we might have time for one quick one. One more? Or don't? I've got a quick microphone there.
Yeah, Selek Jano from A-Privacy. On the technology side, usually authentication was a combination of something you know, have, or are. Because the bank has so much information on you, do you see a play in the big data where the behavior can lead to identifying an identity based on what you do, what transaction, what apps, or where you are, a bunch of like other data points?
Yeah, I mean, that's already at play. I mean, the data on, you know, keystrokes of, you know, even how you enter your PIN or how you enter certain information can be used to triangulate. Certainly, any data we get from, you know, IP, location, all of that, mobile device. So that's already playing a big part in it. At Barclays, for example, we are heavy users of now voice recognition. So when you call in, if we recognize the signature, you don't need to go through the cumbersome identification process, but there's a secondary use of it. It turns out if you rely on technologies like that, you can catch fraud a lot more easily because, you know, the fraudsters actually, it's usually a few guys who are making many calls. And if you get the same call from the same voice signature, you know, 5 or 6 times, by the 7th time, you know, this is a bad guy. So yeah, I think behavioral and biometric are going to become big. I think behavioral is even bigger. You know, you could use hints of, you know, if you charge your credit card and the charge happens to come from, I don't know, the Bahamas, right? And at the same time, your Facebook page or your LinkedIn is actually talking about you being at a conference or being with the family in the Bahamas. That's another reassurance that this transaction is probably clean, as opposed to, you know, your Facebook page is saying you're in China and the charge is coming from the Bahamas. So there is a huge room for big data to play a big positive role on the publicly available information to help. But again, the key there will be that identification. How do I know that this is your Facebook, this is your mobile, this is your account? And that's the trick here. So to the previous question, I really do hope that, you know, whether it's SWIFT or some other consortium can get the banks to work together very quickly, agree on a framework, agree on standards, and start providing this essential service.
Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for today. But if I was just to wrap some quick themes, it seems firmly the panel's opinion that it is an opportunity for the banks and the banking infrastructure or the infrastructure that supports the bank, because there is a strong place to play. They have a unique position. There's already a position of trust, and it's an opportunity to be lost. And I'd like to welcome, I'd like the audience to thank the panel for their comments, and certainly thank you for your time today and your insightful comments.
Thank you.